Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever looked around and felt like society is, well, kind of fracturing at the seams? Today, we're taking a deep, objective dive into the highly provocative worldview of conservative commentator Andrew Wilson. In a recent wide-ranging conversation with podcaster Peter McCormack, Wilson laid out a fascinating ideological framework that touches on literally everything, from theology all the way down to Tinder. Now, our goal here isn't to endorse or condemn his viewpoints, but to map them out clearly. By deconstructing his arguments, we can get a much better grip on the mechanics of his worldview. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the fight for society's soul, the Christian populist vision, economics, wealth, and government, reversing the demographic decline, and finally, modern dating and technology. Let's jump right in. Part 1, the fight for society's soul. Wilson basically diagnoses the modern West as being locked in a massive ideological conflict, driven by extreme polarization and the total breakdown of a shared ethical system. So Wilson completely flips the usual script here. He entirely rejects the idea that fixing politics will somehow fix society. For him, it's a funnel. Politics is strictly downstream from culture, and culture, well, that's entirely downstream from theology. Basically, if your theological foundation cracks, it inherently creates a degraded culture, which then just naturally spawns a corrupt government. To him, the government is literally just a mirror, reflecting the underlying theology. And this brings us to a really crucial rule in Wilson's framework. Without a shared ethical baseline, cultures just fall apart. He uses a wild, extreme example to hammer this home. He says, you simply cannot do business, raise a family, or live next to cannibals. Why? Because the fundamental value sets are worlds apart. For any society to actually function, it absolutely needs a universal ethical glue that everyone buys into. Moving on to part 2, the Christian populist vision. Let's explore how Wilson actually proposes fixing this societal friction. Now, here's a really important distinction. Wilson isn't pushing for a heavy-handed theocratic state where everyone is forced to believe at gunpoint. Not at all. Instead, he advocates for Christian populism or Christian nationalism, where a shared religious value set acts as that foundational glue we just talked about. The idea is that institutions and cultures should just have a fundamentally Christian spine. He argues that even atheists pragmatically benefit from living under these stable, universal ethics, rather than a system where morality is constantly shifting based on everyone's personal feelings. And this creates a super stark contrast in how we look at community. Wilson argues that secular and atheist groups fundamentally lack a binding moral framework. But a religious community, that provides you with a massive built-in support network that is literally morally obligated to root for you. They're required by their faith to support your marriage, pick you up when you fall, and help you succeed. In his view, a lot of modern folks are depressed simply because they are missing this exact kind of bound, deeply obligated community. All right, part 3, economics, wealth, and government. Let's see how this entire worldview spills over into a fierce economic debate about the role of the state. During the discussion, Peter McCormack pushes back with a libertarian angle. He argues that things like central banking, inflation, and giant government bureaucracies actively suck wealth away from the working class straight to the top 1%. But Wilson counters this with what we can call institutional inevitability. He claims that any massive institution, whether that's a bloated government or a completely unregulated giant corporation run by a tycoon, will always inevitably breed corruption, just because of its sheer massive size. When it comes to the wealth divide itself, Wilson shares a really provocative thought experiment. He points out that if you ask folks struggling financially why they are in that situation, they generally point to external forces. Things that just happen to them, completely outside of their control. But flip the script and ask wealthy individuals the exact same question, and they almost always claim their success is down to internal choices, planning, and personal drive. Building on this, Wilson argues that wealth naturally funnels up to people who practice delayed gratification, while the masses tend to stay stuck because they purposefully mismanage money for instant rewards. Which brings us to part 4, reversing the demographic decline. Let's pivot to what Wilson sees as maybe the absolute biggest existential threat to Western society right now. To keep a population perfectly stable, the replacement rate needs to be exactly 2.3 children per woman. Wilson points out that Western nations are currently plummeting way below that baseline. And because we aren't replacing ourselves naturally, governments are essentially forced to rely on mass migration just to keep human capital afloat and keep the GDP churning. So, what's driving this drop? Wilson heavily critiques modern education and our current labor setup. He specifically argues that women are spending their peak reproductive years in their 20s, chasing university degrees in heavily saturated fields, instead of starting families. In his view, this absolutely floods the labor market, drives up inflation, and ultimately puts the nail in the coffin of the single-income family. To pull out of this existential nosedive, Wilson makes the case that society has to return to being strictly organized around biology. Under his framework, this means specifically prioritizing women's unique biological ability to have children, and organizing men around their physical strength to defend, labor, and lead the household. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth do you convince a modern society to actually accept this? Well, Wilson says you definitely don't use force. Instead, you deploy what he calls reverse propaganda. Basically, you make traditionalism trendy again. He proposes offering mothers and family men the exact same intense social respect, privileges, and honorifics that society instinctively gives to military veterans. You essentially incentivize these traditional choices through massive social reward. And finally, part 5, modern dating and technology. Let's look at how all this macro-level philosophy trickles all the way down to the micro-mechanics of everyday life. Take dating apps like Tinder, for example. McCormick suggests these apps removed the healthy fear of rejection and gave men way too much power to just avoid settling down. But Wilson counters with the globalization of dating. He argues that this global reach actually hands women total control over selection, taking their pool of suitors from just a few vocal guys to literally thousands online. But here's the catch. According to Wilson, this dynamic leaves everyone absolutely miserable. Why? Because the masses of women are now fiercely competing for a microscopic fraction of top-tier men, while the average guy gets entirely left behind in the dust. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. By mapping out Andrew Wilson's worldview, we're left staring at a pretty massive tension. Does building a lasting, cohesive society really demand a return to strict, unified traditional values and shared religious duties? Or can our modern world somehow figure out a way to thrive on the back of individualism, endless choices, and ultimate personal freedom? It's a provocative question about the true cost of the way we live today, and I'll leave it right here for you to ponder. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.